My name is Melissa Grant, and I grew up in a world of clay and fire. Some people inherit money, others inherit businesses or heirlooms. Me? I inherited dust, earth, and the sound of a kiln breathing in the night. My parents were potters. They weren't famous or wealthy, but in our riverside village, their names carried weight. People came from miles away to buy their handmade bowls, vases, and lanterns. Not because they were flawless, in fact, the glaze often dripped or a pattern smudged, but because each piece carried something more valuable than perfection: soul. From the time I was 5, I was their shadow. I'd sit cross-legged near the wheel, clay smeared on my cheeks, watching my father's strong hands shape wet earth into form. My mother taught me how to glaze, her voice gentle but firm. Patience, Melissa. Clay remembers everything. Every hesitation, every rush. Treat it like you'd treat a life. I believed her. And maybe that's why, years later, when the very people who shared my blood turned against me, I felt the weight of those words more than ever. Because clay does remember, and so does truth. I wish I could say the betrayal came with warning signs, that I sensed it in the way my sister's smile never quite reached her eyes, or in the rare, hurried phone calls she made from the city. But the truth is, the betrayal came like a thunderclap on a clear day. It arrived in the form of a stiff white envelope delivered by a courier who didn't even look me in the eye as he handed it over. I opened it at the wooden table my father had carved decades ago, the same table where he once balanced clay bowls fresh from the kiln. Inside, neatly stapled pages carried words I never imagined I'd see. Plaintiff, Victoria Grant. Defendant, Melissa Grant. It was my sister's name, and she was suing me. The accusation was bold, vicious. I had forged our father's will. I had illegally taken possession of the pottery workshop and the land it stood on. She wanted it split in half immediately. I sat there frozen, the paper trembling in my hands. My sister, the same sister who once helped me carry buckets of river clay home, the sister who hugged me when I cried after burning my first batch of pots, had turned me into her enemy. That was the first sign. And deep down, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. To understand why that envelope broke me, you have to understand our family. The Grants weren't wealthy. The pottery workshop was everything. It wasn't just a business. It was our home, our reputation, our survival. My parents often said, if the fire in the kiln dies, so does the name Grant. My older sister, Victoria, never saw it that way. Even as a teenager, she hated the dust under her nails, the smell of burning wood, the way her clothes always carried a trace of clay. "This place is a cage," she used to mutter, rolling her eyes whenever my father asked her to help. When she married and moved to the city, she didn't look back. My parents, wanting to bless her new start, sold part of our orchard to give her a large sum of money for a house. "She's our daughter too," my mother told me gently, "and she deserves her share." I didn't protest. Back then, I thought it was fair. She got her future, I got the workshop. After my parents passed away, first my father, then my mother, just 2 years later, the responsibility fell on me. I was 24, young and unprepared, but I refused to let their legacy crumble. Running the workshop alone wasn't easy. There were nights when the kiln smoked too much, when I burned my hands lifting pots, when orders came late and customers grumbled. But with every cracked bowl, I learned. With every sleepless night, I grew stronger. And slowly, the workshop thrived again. People returned, not just for pottery, but to honor the name my parents built. I thought that was enough. I thought my sister was living happily in her city life, too far away to care about the heat of the kiln or the dirt of the clay. But I was wrong. The lawsuit told me she wanted more. She wanted everything. I remember the night I first read through the documents in detail. The oil lamp flickered against the workshop walls, shadows dancing over shelves of freshly glazed bowls. Her words on the page felt like knives. The will is a fabrication. Melissa manipulated our father during his illness. The workshop and land must be divided equally. I pressed my hands against the table, clay dust gritting beneath my palms. Anger rose hot in my chest, but beneath it, something colder, sharper, heartbreak. This wasn't just greed, it was betrayal. Days later, neighbors began whispering. One woman stopped me at the market, frowning. "I heard Victoria says you tricked your parents," she said softly. "Is it true?" The words stung worse than fire. My sister wasn't just dragging me into court, she was poisoning the village against me. For the first time in my life, I felt ashamed walking through the streets where I had grown up.
Ashamed, not because I was guilty, but because my own sister had planted doubt in the place I called home. At night, I couldn't sleep. I'd sit by the kiln, watching flames lick the dark, hearing my father's voice echo in memory. "Melissa, fire doesn't lie. It reveals. It hardens. It shows what is true." I clung to those words. If my sister wanted to fight me in court, then I would fight. Not with anger, not with lies, but with the one weapon stronger than both, truth. And I swore, as the kiln roared and clay hardened in its heat, that I would not let my family's legacy turn to ash. The morning of the first hearing, the village felt different. The usual hum of roosters and market chatter seemed distant, muffled, as if the entire world was holding its breath. I walked the narrow path toward the courthouse with a folder clutched in my arms, my fingers stiff around its edges. Inside were the documents my lawyer had prepared. The will, receipts, notarized records, fragile papers that carried the weight of my parents' wishes. The courthouse itself was an old building with peeling paint and windows clouded by dust. But that morning, it felt like a battlefield. My stomach twisted as I stepped inside. And then I saw her. My sister Victoria sat across the aisle dressed in a tailored navy suit, her hair perfectly pinned back, her expression calm, almost smug. She didn't look at me. Not directly, but when her eyes did flicker my way, they were sharp, calculating, as though I were nothing more than an obstacle to be crushed. I swallowed hard and sat at the defendant's table beside my lawyer, a quiet man named James Holloway. He gave me a small nod, a silent reassurance, before turning his attention to the bench. "All rise," the bailiff called, and everyone stood. The judge entered, robes flowing, and settled into his seat. His voice was steady, practiced. "This is the case of Victoria Grant versus Melissa Grant. The matter concerns alleged forgery of a will and rightful ownership of the Grant family pottery workshop." The words hung heavy in the air. For me, it wasn't just property. It was my life. Victoria's lawyer, a sharp-tongued woman with rimless glasses, stood first. She wasted no time. "Your Honor," she began, "my client has reason to believe that the will presented by the defendant is fraudulent. We contend that Melissa Grant manipulated her late father during his final days, coercing him to sign a document that unfairly benefits her. We request immediate division of the property to restore justice." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. Manipulated? Coerced? Those words weren't just lies. They were poison, crafted to stain my parents' memory and my own name. James rose calmly in response. "Your Honor, the will is authentic. We have already submitted a request for forensic examination of the signature and fingerprint. Additionally, evidence will show that the plaintiff, Ms. Victoria Grant, received a substantial financial settlement from her parents during her marriage, which she formally acknowledged in writing. She now seeks to overturn both their wishes and her own prior agreement." The judge nodded, expression unreadable. "Very well. We will proceed." Then came the hardest part, hearing my sister's voice twisted into accusations. Victoria took the stand, her posture impeccable. She spoke with rehearsed sorrow, her voice just loud enough to tug at sympathy. My father was weak in his last months. He was confused, easily swayed. Melissa spent every day with him, and I believe she used that time to push him into signing papers he didn't truly understand. My father loved us both equally. He would never have chosen to leave me with nothing. The words stung, but not because they were true, because I remembered those last months vividly. Our father, though frail, was clear-minded. He often repeated the same phrase, "Melissa, you are the one who stays with the fire. The workshop is yours to keep alive." But in the courtroom, with Victoria's tears glistening under the fluorescent lights, doubt crept like a shadow. I could see jurors shifting, some frowning, wondering if her story might hold weight. When it was my turn, I walked to the witness stand with legs that felt like clay before firing, soft, unsteady. I placed my hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down. James asked the first question. "Melissa, how long have you been working in the pottery workshop?" "Since I was a child," I answered, my voice steadier than I felt. "My parents taught me. After they passed, I've run it alone for almost 6 years." "And did your father ever express his wishes regarding the future of the workshop?" I nodded. "Yes, many times. He told me it should stay with the one who kept the craft alive. He said my sister had already been given her share when she married." Victoria's lawyer pounced. "Ms. Grant, isn't it true you had full access to your father during his final illness? That you could easily have pressured him into signing whatever you wanted?" I clenched my fists. Number, I cared for him. I honored him. I would never dishonor my father by forcing him into something he didn't believe. The lawyer smirked, as if my words were naive. And yet, conveniently, the will leaves everything to you. Before I could respond, James interjected. Convenient or consistent with decades of family practice, the plaintiff received money and property during her marriage. We have notarized proof. This was not favoritism. It was fairness. The judge raised a hand. "We will allow the forensic report before further debate." That adjourned the first day, but the damage had been done. As I left the courthouse, whispers followed me down the hall. People eyed me like I carried a secret no one could see. That night, back at the workshop, I sat by the kiln with my parents' will spread open on the table. The ink, faded but firm, bore my father's signature. My mother's handwriting added a note, "For Melissa, the one who stays." I traced the letters with my fingertip. This wasn't just paper. This was their voice carried across time. The next morning, James called. His voice was calm, but there was a weight to it. "The results are in," he said. "The will, it's authentic. Signature, fingerprint, everything, no forgery." Relief washed over me, but only for a moment, because I knew Victoria wouldn't give up that easily, and the next hearing would prove just how far she was willing to go. The second hearing arrived on a gray, heavy morning. Clouds pressed low against the horizon as though even the sky sensed what was about to unfold. I clutched my folder of documents tighter than ever as I stepped into the courthouse. The air inside buzzed with whispers. Villagers, reporters, curious onlookers. Family drama was fuel for gossip, and my sister's lawsuit had spread like wildfire. Victoria sat at her table, radiant in a crimson dress this time, her expression polished, composed. She glanced at me once and offered the faintest smirk. It was the kind of look that said, "I've already won. You just don't know it yet." But she didn't know what my lawyer was holding. Not yet. The judge began by announcing the results of the forensic examination. "After thorough review," he said, his voice even, "the court confirms that the will presented by the defendant is genuine. The signature and fingerprint of the late Mr. Grant are authentic, with no evidence of forgery." A murmur rippled across the room. I saw Victoria's shoulders stiffen. Her lawyer adjusted her glasses and leaned in to whisper something urgently, but Victoria only lifted her chin higher, feigning calm. The judge turned to her table. "Do you still wish to contest the will?" Her lawyer rose. "Yes, Your Honor. While the document may be authentic, we contend that undue influence was exerted. Mr. Grant was in a weakened state, and the defendant used her proximity to manipulate his decision." It was the same refrain repeated like a drumbeat. "Melissa is a manipulator. Melissa is a liar." My fists tightened on the table, but James, my lawyer, touched my arm gently. "Wait," he murmured. "Now we show them." When it was our turn, James stood and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we respect the grief this case has stirred, but grief cannot erase facts. The plaintiff claims she was left with nothing. That is not true. Years ago, when Ms. Victoria Grant married and moved to the city, her parents sold part of their land to provide her with a substantial dowry. Not only cash, but enough for a down payment on her current home. This transaction was not informal. It was documented, notarized, and signed by Ms. Grant herself. A hush fell over the courtroom. James opened a manila folder and withdrew a document, its paper yellowed with time, but stamped with the seal of the local notary office. He held it up for the judge. "Here's the contract. It clearly states that upon receipt of this settlement, Ms. Grant relinquished all future claims to the family workshop and adjacent land. Her signature appears here. And here, the notary's seal. We have verified its authenticity." The judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses to read the page. The bailiff carried copies to Victoria's table. I watched as she snatched the paper, scanned it, and for the first time her mask cracked. Color drained from her face. Her lawyer scrambled. This is irrelevant. It was years ago under different circumstances." "No, counsel," the judge interrupted firmly. "This is highly relevant. If true, this agreement indicates the plaintiff knowingly renounced her claim to the property. Do you deny that this is your signature, Ms. Grant?" All eyes turned to Victoria. Her lips parted, then closed. She swallowed hard, fingers trembling against the page. For a long moment, silence pressed heavy in the courtroom. Finally, she whispered, I don't remember signing it." Gasps rose from the gallery. The judge's expression hardened. "Whether you remember or not, this court will determine its validity. For now, the document stands." I exhaled, a shaky breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Relief surged through me. Not triumph, not yet, but a fragile hope. My parents' truth had found its way into the light, but the hearing wasn't over. Victoria tried one last desperate pivot. She rose from her chair, her voice trembling, not with weakness, but with carefully staged emotion. "Your Honor," she said, "my sister has always been the favorite." She stayed home. She received attention, while I was pushed aside. That agreement, I was pressured into it. My parents told me it was just a formality, not real. I never thought they would actually take my share away, and now Melissa wants to erase me completely. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. A few spectators shifted uncomfortably, moved by her performance. But then, from the back of the room, a voice cut through. "That's not true." Heads turned. It was Mr. Dalton, our old neighbor, a man in his 70s who had known our family for decades. He walked slowly forward, leaning on his cane. The judge allowed him to speak as a witness. "I was there," Dalton said firmly. "I remember when your parents sold that orchard. I remember the day they handed Victoria the envelope with money. She thanked them. She said, and I quote, 'This will help me start a new life. Melissa can keep the dirty clay.'" Gasps filled the room again. My heart pounded. I remembered that day too, faintly, but hearing it aloud was like fire spreading through the lies. Another voice rose. Mrs. Jenkins, a family friend. "I recall it as well. Your parents were clear. They wanted each daughter provided for. Victoria got her share early. Melissa was entrusted with the workshop. That was the deal." One by one, the truth poured in, carried by those who had seen, who remembered, who refused to let lies stand unchallenged. Victoria's face hardened. The tears dried. The mask slipped entirely, revealing not sorrow, but fury. She hissed something to her lawyer, who quickly requested a recess. The judge granted it, but the damage was done. As I stepped out into the hallway, the air felt lighter. For months I had carried the weight of accusations, of whispers painting me as a thief. But now the truth was no longer just mine. It belonged to everyone in that room. James turned to me, his eyes steady. This is the turning point. She thought she could twist memory, play victim, but paper doesn't lie, and neither do people who remember. I nodded, but inside, my emotions tangled. Relief, yes. Vindication, maybe. But also sorrow. Sorrow that it had come to this, that my own sister stood on the other side of truth, clutching lies like a shield. As the recess ended and we prepared to return, I glanced through the window at the gray sky outside. The clouds were breaking. A sliver of sunlight pierced through, casting a golden line across the floor, and I thought of my father's words again. Fire doesn't lie. It reveals, it hardens, it shows what is true. Inside that courtroom, the fire was burning, and slowly it was stripping away every mask. The courtroom felt different when we returned from recess. The whispers were sharper now, the air thicker with tension. Everyone had seen the cracks in Victoria's story. Everyone had heard the neighbors. The truth was no longer buried under polished speeches and rehearsed tears. It was out, raw and undeniable. But if I thought my sister would give up, I was wrong. When the judge called the session back to order, Victoria's lawyer rose immediately, her voice louder, sharper than before. "Your Honor," she said, "while the defense has produced documents and called on friendly witnesses, we cannot ignore the reality. Family dynamics are complex. A piece of paper, a faded memory, these do not erase decades of favoritism and manipulation. My client deserves her rightful share." She turned dramatically toward me, pointing like I was a criminal. Melissa Grant controlled access to her parents during their final days. She isolated them. She kept her sister at a distance. She orchestrated all of this. The words stung, but before I could react, the judge held up a hand. Enough conjecture. "Do you have evidence of this claim?" The lawyer hesitated. We have testimonies that Victoria was often excluded." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Exclusion is not proof of coercion. Do not waste this court's time." The lawyer sat down, flustered. For the first time, her confidence cracked. Then Victoria stood herself. She didn't wait for permission. She simply rose, tissue in hand, and began to speak directly to the courtroom. "I am not here for money," she said, her voice trembling with the perfect pitch of sorrow. "I am here because I loved my parents, because I know, deep in my heart, that they would never want one daughter to have everything and the other to be left with nothing. I was misled into signing that agreement years ago. I thought it was symbolic, not binding. My parents promised me both daughters would always be equal. Melissa has twisted their words, twisted their love to serve herself." Her tears fell, glistening in the harsh courtroom lights. A few spectators murmured, moved by her performance. I felt my throat tighten, not with guilt, but with grief. This was my sister, and every word from her mouth was a dagger. Then something unexpected happened. The judge leaned forward, his voice calm but stern. "Miss Grant, you say you were misled into signing a legal, notarized agreement. Did you contest it at the time? Did you file any complaint? Did you ever attempt to revoke it?" Victoria froze. Her lips parted, but no words came. The silence stretched long, too long. Finally, she whispered, "No, I didn't." The judge nodded slowly. "Then the agreement stands as evidence of your intent. This court cannot disregard documented truth for the sake of unverified feelings." It was like watching a wall crumble. Victoria's shoulders sagged. For a moment, I thought she might collapse into her chair. But then anger sparked in her eyes. She slammed the tissue onto the table, her voice rising, no longer trembling but sharp and bitter. "This is all Melissa's doing. She manipulated everyone, our parents, the neighbors, even you." Her outburst shocked the room. Even her lawyer looked horrified, tugging at her sleeve to sit down. The judge's gavel struck the desk sharply. "Order! Ms. Grant, if you continue to disrupt this court with baseless accusations, I will hold you in contempt." But Victoria wasn't finished. She spun toward me, her face twisted, eyes blazing. "You always wanted to be the favorite. You think clay and fire make you special? You think staying here makes you better than me? Our parents loved me too. They loved me." The courtroom was silent except for her voice, echoing off the walls, shrill and desperate. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Then James, my lawyer, stood. His tone was calm, almost gentle. "Your Honor, if it pleases the court, I have one final exhibit." From his folder, he withdrew a smaller document, folded carefully, worn with years. He handed it to the bailiff, who carried it to the judge. "This," James said, "is a letter written by Mr. Grant, found among his personal effects after his passing. It is not a will, but a handwritten note in his own words. It reinforces what he intended for his daughters." The judge unfolded it, read silently, then cleared his throat. It was my father's handwriting. Even from across the room, I recognized the uneven strokes, the way he pressed too hard with his pen. The judge read aloud, "Victoria has begun her new life. We gave her what we could to help her start. Melissa remains here, with the fire, with the clay. The workshop belongs to her, as does the duty of keeping our name alive. This is fair. This is love. May they both understand someday." The words filled the room like a tide. My chest ached as though my father himself was speaking. Victoria's face crumpled. She shook her head violently. "No, that's fake. She planted it." But the judge silenced her with a firm strike of the gavel. "This court will authenticate the letter, but at this point the pattern is clear. The will is valid. The prior agreement is valid. The testimonies are credible. And now, this note further illustrates intent. Ms. Grant, your claims are collapsing under the weight of truth." Victoria sank into her chair, her fury draining into silence. Her lawyer buried her face in her hands. I sat frozen, my heart hammering, not with triumph, but with something heavier, sorrow, loss. Because in that moment I realized, even if the court ruled in my favor, even if the workshop was safe, something else was gone forever. The bond between sisters. The judge adjourned the session. "We will return for final judgment, but as it stands, the evidence overwhelmingly supports the defendant." I rose slowly, my legs unsteady. Around me, people whispered, some sympathetic, some scandalized, but I barely heard them. As I stepped out of the courtroom, the afternoon light spilled through the high windows, warm and golden. For the first time in months, I felt it on my face, and it didn't feel heavy. The fire had burned through the lies. All that remained was truth, raw, unyielding, impossible to deny. The day of the final judgment arrived with unsettling calm. The sky was clear, the streets unusually quiet as I walked toward the courthouse. In my chest, my heart pounded like a drum. Months of hearings, whispers, sleepless nights. All of it was building to this moment. I carried nothing but a small notebook, one my mother had once given me. Inside, she had scribbled recipes, clay glaze formulas, little sketches of patterns she wanted to try someday. I told myself it was a reminder. This wasn't just about land or money. It was about them, about keeping their memory alive. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation. Neighbors filled the benches. Even distant relatives had come, drawn by the spectacle of two sisters tearing each other apart over inheritance. I could feel their eyes on me as I sat down, my hands folded tightly in my lap. Victoria entered moments later. She no longer looked radiant or composed. Her crimson lipstick couldn't hide the pallor of her face, nor could her carefully ironed suit disguise the slump of her shoulders. She avoided my gaze, but the tension in her jaw revealed the fury still burning beneath the surface. "All rise," the bailiff called. The judge entered, settled into his chair, and began. "This court has reviewed all documents, testimony, and evidence in the matter of Victoria Grant versus Melissa Grant. The question at hand, the validity of the will of the late Mr. Grant, the legal standing of a prior notarized agreement, and the rightful ownership of the Grant family pottery workshop." The silence was absolute. Even the air seemed to pause. The judge adjusted his glasses and continued. "The forensic analysis confirms the will is authentic. The plaintiff's allegations of forgery are without basis. Furthermore, the notarized agreement between Ms. Victoria Grant and her parents is legally binding. It clearly states she received financial settlement in exchange for relinquishing her claim to the workshop. Testimonies from credible witnesses corroborate this fact. Finally, the handwritten note from Mr. Grant, authenticated by handwriting experts, supports his clear intention that the workshop should remain with Melissa Grant." He looked up, his eyes steady, his voice firm. "Therefore, the court rules in favor of the defendant, Melissa Grant. The pottery workshop and its adjoining land are rightfully hers, as per the wishes of the deceased and the law. The plaintiff's claims are dismissed in their entirety." The gavel struck once, sharp as thunder. For a moment I couldn't move. Relief flooded me, hot and dizzying. The words, "rules in favor of the defendant," echoed in my ears. After months of lies and accusations, the truth had prevailed. But alongside relief came something else, a hollowness. I glanced at Victoria. She sat motionless, staring straight ahead, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her lawyer whispered urgently in her ear, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were glassy, empty. I wanted to feel vindicated. I wanted to feel victorious. But all I felt was tired. Outside the courthouse, reporters and villagers gathered, their questions flying. "Melissa, how do you feel about the verdict? Do you think your sister will appeal? Is the family bond broken forever?" I didn't answer. I just walked past them, clutching my mother's notebook against my chest. When I reached the street corner, away from the noise, I let myself breathe. The workshop was safe. The kiln would keep burning. My parents' legacy was protected. But what about my sister? That night, I sat alone in the workshop. The flames of the kiln flickered against the walls, casting long shadows over shelves of pots and bowls. I thought of my father's words. Fire doesn't lie. It reveals. It hardens. It shows what is true. The fire had revealed everything. It had hardened the clay of truth. But it had also burned away whatever fragile bond remained between Victoria and me. I remembered us as children, sitting by the river, our bare feet dangling in the water. She used to braid my hair while we laughed at silly stories. She wasn't always like this. Greed had changed her. Or maybe resentment had been there all along, festering until it consumed her. The verdict had given me justice, but not peace. A few days later, neighbors came by with congratulations. "You did the right thing," they said. "Your parents would be proud." I smiled politely, thanked them, but inside I felt uneasy. Was pride what my parents would have wanted? Or would they have wept, seeing their daughters tear each other apart in court? Victoria didn't appeal. Instead, she vanished back to the city, cutting ties with the village entirely. She didn't call. She didn't visit. It was as though she had erased me from her life completely, and maybe that was the real price of truth. Weeks passed. Life settled. Orders for pottery came in. The kiln roared day and night, and I found myself working harder than ever, almost as if keeping busy could silence the ache inside. But sometimes, late at night, when the workshop was quiet and the embers glowed faintly in the dark, I thought about her. Did she regret what she had done? Did she feel anger, or did she simply hate me now? I would never know. What I did know was this. I had chosen to protect the legacy of my parents, and the court had recognized that choice. The workshop would remain in the family. The name Grant would continue, etched into every pot, every bowl, every fragile piece that survived the fire. One evening, as I pulled a batch of glazed bowls from the kiln, I noticed one had cracked along the rim. I almost threw it aside, but then I looked closer. The crack was thin, delicate, like a scar, and yet the bowl was still beautiful, still strong. I set it gently on the shelf, deciding to keep it, because maybe that was me now, scarred, changed, but still standing. The judgment had given me ownership. The aftermath had given me clarity. Family could betray you, lies could wound you, but truth could endure the fire. And like clay in the kiln, I had emerged harder, sharper, unbreakable. In the end, this story was never just about land or clay. It was about betrayal, about how even the people you share blood with can choose lies over love, greed over truth. My sister tried to take everything. She dragged me through court, painted me as a manipulator, and nearly shattered the memory of our parents. But the fire of truth burned brighter than her lies. The court saw it, the village saw it, and deep down I know she saw it too. Yes, I won. The workshop is still mine, as my parents intended. But victory feels complicated, because what I lost along the way can't be measured in money or property. It was the bond I once believed unbreakable. Still, maybe that's the lesson. Clay only hardens when it survives the fire, and so do we. To anyone who's ever been betrayed by the people they thought they could trust, remember this. You are not weak for standing up for yourself. You are not selfish for protecting your peace. And no matter how loud the lies may get, truth always has its own voice. Thank you for watching. If this story spoke to you, please like, share, and subscribe, because your story matters too.